Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 14 years, and throughout that extensive career, he had developed an extraordinary ability to navigate unexpected moments with grace, humor, and genuine human compassion. He had witnessed contestants break down in tears over victories that represented life-changing financial relief, had listened to families share stories of hardship and perseverance, and had created countless moments of connection that reminded viewers why human stories mattered more than any game. On this warm June afternoon in 2025, as he prepared to welcome two families onto the stage for what appeared to be routine programming, Steve had no indication that he was about to hear a confession so emotionally complex and devastating that it would require him to pause completely, step away from his role as entertainer, and simply be present with someone experiencing one of the most difficult moments of their life. What would unfold over the next hour would become one of the most emotionally raw and psychologically profound moments in television history, forcing everyone present to confront complicated truths about sacrifice, regret, and the choices people make that haunt them forever. Before we explore this extraordinarily moving story about secrets, maternal love, and the courage required to speak truths that have been buried for decades, if you believe that some confessions deserve to be heard with compassion rather than judgment, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these powerful moments that remind us of the complexity of human decision-making and the weight of choices that can never be undone. The Sullivan family from Boston, Massachusetts stood ready to compete, and leading them was 58-year-old Patricia Sullivan. Patricia presented as an elegant woman whose professional bearing and carefully composed appearance suggested someone accustomed to maintaining control in challenging situations. She had introduced herself during preliminary interviews as a recently retired high school principal who had dedicated her career to education and who now spent her time volunteering with literacy programs for underserved communities. Standing beside Patricia were her husband of 35 years, Richard, her younger sister Margaret, her nephew, and a young woman named Emily, who Patricia had introduced somewhat vaguely as a family friend who had been close to the Sullivans for many years. The group demonstrated appropriate enthusiasm and positive energy, though Steve noticed that Patricia seemed unusually tense, and that she kept glancing at Emily with an expression that combined affection and something else that Steve could not quite identify, but that registered as significant. Patricia Sullivan had built what appeared from external observation to be an exemplary life characterized by professional achievement, stable marriage, community service, and the respect of colleagues and students who had benefited from her dedicated leadership. She had risen from classroom teacher to principal over a 30-year career, guiding thousands of students through their educational journeys and earning recognition for her commitment to creating inclusive environments where all students could succeed regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. Her marriage to Richard had been solid and supportive, characterized by mutual respect and shared values even though they had never had children, a fact that Patricia explained to curious friends and family as reflecting a mutual decision to focus on their careers and their contributions to the broader community rather than raising their own family. What nobody in Patricia's current life knew, what she had kept hidden for 39 years through careful construction of narratives and deliberate omission of certain chapters from her personal history, was that Patricia had given birth to a daughter when she was 19 years old and had made the agonizing decision to place that child for adoption. The pregnancy had occurred during Patricia's sophomore year of college, the result of a relationship with a young man who had disappeared immediately upon learning about the pregnancy, leaving Patricia to navigate the situation entirely alone. She had been terrified to tell her parents, both of whom held traditional values and whose disappointment and anger she feared more than almost anything. She had hidden the pregnancy for as long as possible, wearing loose clothing and avoiding situations where her changing body might be noticed, living in constant fear of discovery and judgment. When Patricia could no longer conceal her condition, she had finally confessed to her mother, bracing for the reaction she knew would come. Her mother's response had been exactly as devastating as Patricia had feared, a combination of shame, anger, and insistence that the pregnancy be handled in a way that would minimize embarrassment to the family. Patricia's parents had sent her to live with a distant aunt in another state for the final months of her pregnancy, telling friends and extended family that Patricia was taking a semester off from college to help care for her elderly aunt who was recovering from surgery. Patricia had spent those isolated months feeling completely alone, carrying a child she already loved, but could not envision any way to keep given her age, her financial circumstances, and her family's absolute refusal to provide support if she chose to parent. The adoption had been arranged through a private agency that specialized in placing infants with carefully vetted families who desperately wanted children. Patricia had been assured that her daughter would go to a loving home with parents who would provide everything Patricia could not, including financial stability, a two-parent household, and the kind of secure, traditional family structure that adoption agencies in that era considered ideal. Patricia had held her daughter for exactly 2 hours after giving birth, memorizing every detail of her face, whispering promises that she would always love her even though she could not raise her, and then had signed the papers that legally severed her parental rights and gave her daughter to strangers who would rename her and raise her as their own. The grief that followed had been profound and enduring in ways that Patricia had not anticipated. She had returned to college and had thrown herself into her studies with desperate intensity, using academic achievement as distraction from the constant ache of missing the daughter she had given away. She had graduated with honors, pursued her teaching credential, and built a career that allowed her to channel her maternal instincts into caring for other people's children since she could not parent her own. She had eventually met Richard, a kind and stable man who had seemed like exactly the partner she needed to build a different kind of life. When Richard had asked about children early in their relationship, Patricia had told him that she did not want to have kids, offering explanations about career focus and personal choice while concealing the truth that she had already had a child, and that the grief of that loss made the prospect of parenting other children feel like betrayal. Patricia had lived with her secret for nearly 4 decades, occasionally wondering about her daughter, but having no information about her whereabouts or well-being due to the closed adoption that had been standard practice in that era. The adoption agency had assured Patricia that records would remain sealed and that she would have no contact with her daughter unless the child initiated a search after reaching adulthood and both parties consented to contact. Patricia had registered with several adoption reunion databases over the years, indicating her willingness to be contacted if her daughter ever searched for her, but had received no response and had gradually accepted that she might never know what had become of the baby she had held so briefly. 3 years earlier, Patricia had received a message through one of the reunion registries from a woman named Emily Brennan, who believed that Patricia might be her biological mother based on adoption records, birth dates, and the limited non-identifying information that had been available through the agency. The message had been carefully worded and respectful, explaining that Emily had always known she was adopted, that she had wonderful adoptive parents who supported her search for her biological family, and that she hoped Patricia might be willing to meet or at least exchange information about medical history and the circumstances of the adoption. Patricia had been overwhelmed by the message, experiencing a combination of joy that her daughter had found her, terror about what the contact might mean for the carefully constructed life she had built, and profound grief for all the years they had lost. Patricia had responded to Emily's message, and they had begun a cautious correspondence that eventually led to an in-person meeting. That first meeting had been emotionally overwhelming for both women as Patricia saw in Emily's face the baby she had given away, now grown into a 36-year-old woman who had her eyes, her smile, and mannerisms that were somehow familiar despite their having never spent time together. Emily had been generous and understanding, asking questions about the circumstances of her adoption without judgment or anger, sharing information about her life with her adoptive family, and expressing interest in building some kind of relationship with Patricia if Patricia was willing. Over the subsequent 3 years, Patricia and Emily had developed a relationship that was complicated and emotionally fraught, but also deeply meaningful for both of them. They had met regularly for coffee or meals, had exchanged messages and phone calls, and had gradually built a connection that could never fully compensate for the lost years, but that provided something valuable for both of them. Patricia had not told Richard about Emily's existence, unable to find the words to explain that she had lied by omission for their entire marriage about having given birth to a child. She had not told her sister Margaret or anyone else in her current life, maintaining the fiction that Emily was simply a young friend from her volunteer work, while privately cherishing the relationship with the daughter she had never stopped loving. The decision to invite Emily to be part of the Family Feud experience had been Patricia's attempt to include her daughter in a family activity while still maintaining the public fiction about the nature of their relationship. Patricia had rationalized that appearing on a game show together would create a shared memory and would allow Emily to meet Richard and other family members in a context that did not require explaining their true connection. Emily had agreed to participate despite her discomfort with the deception, understanding that Patricia was not yet ready to disclose their relationship publicly, but hoping that perhaps the experience might create an opportunity for Patricia to finally tell the truth. As Steve Harvey initiated the game with characteristic warmth and energy, the Sullivan family performed well. Patricia answered questions competently, drawing on intelligence and quick thinking that had served her throughout her educational career. Steve observed the family dynamics carefully, particularly noticing the way Patricia looked at Emily with an intensity that seemed disproportionate if Emily was simply a family friend, as Patricia had indicated. During a commercial break, Steve engaged Patricia in conversation, asking about her career in education and her retirement plans. Patricia responded with appropriate enthusiasm, but seemed distracted, her attention repeatedly drawn to Emily, who stood several feet away talking with Richard and Margaret. The moment that changed everything occurred during the third round when the question appeared asking contestants to name something you regret not telling someone before it was too late. Patricia buzzed in first and stood frozen for a long moment, her expression shifting through a series of emotions that Steve recognized as internal struggle. Finally, Patricia answered with quiet intensity, stating the truth about who they really are to you. The response registered as the number 3 answer on the board, and the audience applauded routinely. Steve paused, however, noting the way Patricia had delivered the answer with such specific pain, and the way she had glanced at Emily immediately after speaking. Without fully understanding why, Steve followed an instinct that had served him well throughout his career. He looked at Patricia and asked gently whether she had answered that question from personal experience, or whether she was simply guessing what the survey respondents had said. The studio fell into expectant silence as everyone waited for Patricia's response. Patricia stood completely still for what felt like an eternity, visibly wrestling with a decision that Steve could see was monumentally difficult. Finally, Patricia looked at Emily, then at Richard, then back at Steve, and made a choice that would transform everything. Patricia's voice shook as she began to speak, stating that yes, she had answered from personal experience, that there was a truth she had been keeping from her husband and her family for 39 years, and that standing on the stage had made her realize that she could not continue living with the deception any longer. Steve set his cards down carefully and took several steps toward Patricia, his expression shifting from curious to concerned as he recognized that something profound was about to be revealed. Patricia took a deep breath and then spoke the words she had been unable to say for nearly 4 decades. She stated that Emily was not a family friend, but was actually her biological daughter, whom she had given up for adoption when she was 19 years old, and who had found her 3 years earlier through adoption reunion registries. The studio fell into shocked silence as everyone processed what Patricia had just revealed. Richard stood frozen, his expression shifting from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like profound hurt, as he realized that his wife had hidden something this significant throughout their entire marriage. Margaret looked equally shocked, trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the woman who had apparently lived a completely hidden parallel life. Emily stood very still, tears streaming down her face, clearly moved that Patricia had finally spoken the truth publicly, but also recognizing the enormous disruption this confession would create in Patricia's marriage and family relationships. Steve Harvey stood motionless for a long moment, visibly struggling to process what he had just heard, and to determine how to respond to a confession this emotionally complex and personally devastating. Finally, he did something that would become legendary in Family Feud history. He walked over to Patricia, gently took her hand, and said that they needed to stop everything and take a moment to address what had just happened, because it was far too important to simply move past, as if it were routine game show content. He turned to the production team and requested that they pause taping to allow the family to process Patricia's confession and to determine how they wanted to proceed. During the extended break that followed, Steve created space for a conversation that was no longer about entertainment, but about human beings navigating an extraordinarily difficult emotional situation. Richard approached Patricia with an expression that combined hurt, confusion, and an obvious need for explanation. His voice shaking, he asked Patricia directly why she had never told him about Emily in 35 years of marriage, why she had allowed him to believe they had chosen not to have children when the truth was that she already had a daughter, and whether there were other significant secrets he did not know about. Patricia responded through tears, explaining that she had been ashamed of the pregnancy and adoption, that she had been terrified of Richard's judgment, and that as years passed, the lie had become increasingly difficult to correct until it seemed impossible to tell the truth without destroying everything. Emily approached both Patricia and Richard, her voice gentle but clear as she explained that she had encouraged Patricia repeatedly over the past 3 years to tell the truth, but that she had respected Patricia's fear and reluctance, even while believing that honesty was the only sustainable path forward. She told Richard that she had not wanted to be part of any deception, but that her desire to have some relationship with her biological mother had led her to accept Patricia's terms, even when those terms required participating in a fiction that felt wrong. If this story has moved you, if Patricia's confession has reminded you of the weight that secrets carry, and the relief that can come from finally speaking truths that have been buried for years, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who needs to remember that honesty, even when it comes late and causes pain, is ultimately healthier than maintaining deceptions that prevent authentic connection and that burden everyone involved with the weight of unsaid truths.